The Galactic Council had seen many things in their thousand-year reign over the known universe. They had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, the birth of new technologies that seemed impossible, and the destruction of entire star systems. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared them for what they were looking at now. Admiral Kethros of the Zephyrian fleet stood frozen at the command center of the massive space station orbiting Centauri Prime. His four arms trembled as he stared at the holographic display, showing the impossible vessel that had just appeared at the edge of their territory. The ship wasn't just breaking the laws of physics. It was laughing at them, spitting in their face, and doing a victory dance on their grave. The vessel was massive, easily 3 times the size of their largest dreadnought, but that wasn't what made it terrifying. What made it terrifying was how it moved. Ships in space followed predictable patterns. They accelerated. They turned using thrusters. They followed Newton's laws like every other piece of matter in the universe. This thing moved like it was swimming through water, flowing and undulating in ways that made Kethros's brain hurt just watching it. "Sir," Communications Officer Valana's voice cracked as she spoke. "We're receiving a transmission from the unknown vessel." "Put it through," Kethros commanded, his military training keeping his voice steady despite the fear crawling up his spine. The main screen flickered, and suddenly they were looking at a creature that defied everything they thought they knew about intelligent life. It was bipedal like many species, but there was something about its eyes, those small, dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets older than stars. Its skin was pale, almost white, and it had strange hair covering the top of its head. "Greetings," the creature said in perfect galactic standard, though its mouth moved in ways that suggested it was speaking a different language entirely. "I am Captain Sarah Chun of the United Earth Navy vessel Defiance. We come in peace, but we come prepared." Kethros found his voice. "Unknown vessel. You have entered Galactic Council space without authorization. Your ship appears to be using technology that violates several fundamental laws of physics. Explain yourself immediately." The human, for that's what it called itself, smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "Admiral, with respect, your laws of physics are more like suggestions where we come from. We've learned to be very creative with suggestions." Behind Captain Chun, Kethros could see other humans moving about what appeared to be their bridge. They moved with casual efficiency, as if commanding a ship that broke reality was just another day at the office. One of them, a larger male with dark skin, was actually drinking something from a small container while monitoring readings that made no sense whatsoever. "Impossible," whispered Dr. Thoric, the station's chief scientist. "Look at those energy readings. That ship is simultaneously existing in multiple dimensions while maintaining perfect structural integrity. The power requirements alone should collapse it into a black hole." Captain Chin heard him somehow, despite the transmission being one way. "Dr. Thoric, right? We've been monitoring your communications. Fascinating theories you have about dimensional physics. Bit outdated, but fascinating nonetheless. How did you—" Dr. Thoric began. "We've been watching you folks for about 50 years now," Chen interrupted casually. "Studying your technology, your societies, your wars. Very educational. We particularly enjoyed your recent conflict with the hegemony. Impressive tactics, though a bit limited by your understanding of space-time mechanics." Admiral Kethros felt a chill run through his entire body. 50 years. This species had been watching them for 50 years without being detected. That was impossible. The Galactic Council had the most advanced sensor networks in known space. Nothing could hide from them for 50 years. "What do you want?" he asked, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "Want?" Chun laughed, and the sound was both musical and terrifying. "Admiral, we don't want anything from you. We're here to offer you something. A choice, actually." The tactical display suddenly lit up with new contacts. Dozens of them. Ships appearing out of nowhere all around the station, all around their fleet, all around their entire defensive perimeter. Each one was different. Each one seemed to ignore physics in its own unique way. Some appeared to be made of crystallized light. Others looked like they were constructed from folded space itself. One particularly disturbing vessel seemed to exist as a probability cloud that occasionally collapsed into solid matter. "Where did they come from?" Valana screamed, her professionalism finally cracking. "They've been there the whole time," Chin said matter-of-factly. "You just couldn't see them. Humans are very good at not being seen when we don't want to be." It's a survival trait we picked up back when we were being hunted by things with very large teeth. Kethros's mind raced through possibilities. Cloaking technology was known, but not like this. These ships hadn't been cloaked. They had been invisible to sensors, to the naked eye, to everything. It was as if they existed in the spaces between reality until they chose to step into the visible universe. Admiral, Chun continued, her tone becoming more serious, your council has done a decent job managing this part of the galaxy. We've been impressed by your attempts at peace, your efforts to minimize casualties and conflicts, your general desire to preserve life. It shows promise. Promise for what? For survival, Chun said simply. You see, there are things out there, things between the stars, things from other dimensions, things that make your worst nightmares look like pleasant dreams. We've been fighting them for longer than your civilization has existed. We've gotten very good at it, but we've also learned that we can't do it alone forever. The display shifted, showing star charts that Kethros had never seen before. Regions of space that appeared to be completely empty, but, as the human technology revealed them, were crawling with massive, dark shapes that hurt to look at directly. The Council has a choice to make, Chen announced. You can continue as you have been, pretending you're the apex of galactic civilization, waiting for the day those things notice you exist. Or you can join us. Learn from us. Help us push back the darkness that wants to devour everything you've built. And if we refuse? Kethros asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. Chen's smile returned, but this time it was sad rather than terrifying. Then, we'll remember you fondly when those things eventually find you. Humans are sentimental that way. We collect memories of civilizations that chose not to survive. The transmission ended, leaving the command center in stunned silence. Outside the station's windows, the impossible human fleet waited, their ships moving in patterns that defied comprehension. Some were phasing in and out of visible reality. Others appeared to be communicating through manipulations of gravity itself. Sir, Valana whispered, what do we do? Admiral Kethros stared at the fleet that had appeared from nowhere, commanded by creatures that treated the laws of physics like optional guidelines, offering protection from horrors he couldn't even imagine. In all his years of military service, through all the battles and negotiations and diplomatic incidents, he had never faced a decision quite like this. Give me a direct line to the High Council, he said finally, and someone find me everything we have on human mythology. Something tells me we're going to need to understand what kind of creatures we're dealing with. As alarms continued to sound throughout the station, and frantic reports came in from every corner of Council space about mysterious human vessels appearing near major installations, Admiral Kethros couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change forever. The humans had been watching them for 50 years, learning everything about them while remaining completely invisible. The question now was, what else had they been watching? And, more importantly, what had been watching the humans? 3 days after first contact, the emergency session of the Galactic Council convened on Nexus Prime, the massive artificial world that served as the political center of their civilization. Representatives from all 12 major species sat in the Great Chamber, their various forms of breathing apparatus creating a symphony of hisses, clicks, and mechanical whirs as they struggled to process what they had learned. Counselor Vex of the Synthetic Collective spoke first, her crystalline form pulsing with nervous energy. The data is impossible. These humans claim to have mastered technologies that our greatest minds declared theoretically impossible. Faster-than-light travel without using hyperspace corridors. Energy generation that appears to violate conservation laws. Weapons that exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Not just impossible, interrupted Dr. Zane, the hegemony's chief researcher. Dangerous beyond comprehension. Look at this battle footage they shared with us. The chamber's main display activated, showing what appeared to be empty space. Then, the human technology kicked in, revealing the truth. Space itself was alive with massive, writhing entities that seemed to be made of pure darkness and hunger. They moved through the void like cosmic serpents, each one large enough to swallow a moon. The Shadow Fleet, came a voice from the chamber's entrance. Captain Chun walked in uninvited, her footsteps echoing strangely as if she was walking on the bottom of an ocean rather than solid metal. That's what we call them. They exist primarily in what you might call the space between spaces. They've been slowly consuming universes for longer than matter has existed. Security forces moved to intercept her, but their weapons and energy fields simply passed through her, as if she wasn't there. She continued walking toward the center of the chamber, completely unbothered by the fact that she was surrounded by the galaxy's most powerful military forces. "How did you get in here?" demanded General Karoth of the War Clans, his massive frame bristling with built-in weapon systems that were now completely useless. "I've been here the whole time," Chen replied casually. "Humans are very good at being overlooked when necessary. It's a talent we developed during our early evolution. When everything on your planet wants to eat you, you learn to hide very, very well." The battle footage continued, showing human vessels engaging the Shadow Fleet. What Kethros had initially thought was impossible now seemed like a mild understatement. Human ships phased through enemy attacks, materialized inside hostile vessels, and fired weapons that seemed to erase their targets from existence rather than simply destroying them. These creatures, Chun gestured toward the display, consume civilizations. Not just the people or the planets. They eat the very concept of a species existing. When they're done with the civilization, it's as if that civilization never existed at all. History rewrites itself. Even memories fade. "Preposterous," scoffed Counselor Marin of the Trade Federation. "Memory cannot be consumed. Information cannot be destroyed once it's distributed widely enough." Chun smiled that terrifying smile again. "Can you remember the Keth Empire?" The chamber fell silent. Kethros felt a strange sensation, as if something was trying to surface in his mind but couldn't quite break through. "The Keth were your neighbors for 300 years, Chun continued. "They had beautiful crystalline cities that sang in the solar wind. Their poetry was considered the finest in the galaxy. They invented the quantum resonance drives that half your ships still use. They had colonies in 47 systems." As she spoke, Kethros felt memories trying to form, like looking at shapes through thick fog. He could almost remember something about crystalline cities, about poetry that made listeners weep with its beauty. "The Shadow Fleet consumed them 6 months ago," Chin said quietly. "Completely. Only we remember them now, because we exist partially outside normal space-time. Everyone else, it's like trying to remember a dream after you wake up, isn't it?" Dr. Zane's voice was shaking. "The missing systems. The 47 systems we couldn't account for in our galactic census. We assumed they were uninhabited, that our records were wrong, but you had the nagging feeling you were forgetting something important," Chun finished. "That's what's left when the Shadow Fleet is done. A sense of loss without understanding what was lost." The display shifted, showing tactical analyses that human scientists had compiled over centuries of warfare. The Shadow Fleet wasn't just large. It was vast beyond comprehension. Thousands of entities, each one capable of consuming entire civilizations. And they were moving methodically through the galaxy, following patterns that suggested they had done this many times before in many other galaxies. "Your turn is coming," Chen announced. "Based on their current consumption pattern, they'll notice your civilization in approximately 18 standard months. When they do, you'll have perhaps 72 hours before the first scout entities arrive." "Why should we trust you?" demanded Counselor Prime Omega, the mechanical leader of the Silicon Hegemony. "You appear with impossible technology, claim to have been watching us in secret for decades, and now you tell us we're doomed unless we accept your help." Chen nodded appreciatively. "Very good questions. You shouldn't trust us. Humans are demonstrably untrustworthy. We lie constantly, we break agreements when it suits us, and we have a disturbing tendency to find violence entertaining." She paused. "But we're also the only reason your galaxy still exists." The display changed again, showing a timeline stretching back thousands of years. Wave after wave of Shadow Fleet incursions, each one targeting different sectors of the galaxy. But each wave was smaller than it should have been, broken up, confused, sometimes turning back entirely. "We've been fighting them for so long we barely remember what peace feels like," Chan said, her voice taking on a haunted quality. "We've lost entire sectors of human space. Billions of our people consumed and forgotten. But we've also learned how to hurt them, how to confuse them, how to make them think twice about entering our territory." "What makes you so special?" asked Kethros. "What allows humans to fight these creatures when no one else can?" Chen was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was different, older, sadder, carrying the weight of unimaginable experience. We've always been predators, Admiral. Even when we were the smallest, weakest creatures on our world, we were hunters. We learned to kill things much larger and stronger than ourselves through cleverness, persistence, and an absolute refusal to give up. When we reached the stars, we brought those instincts with us. She gestured, and the air around her shimmered, revealing glimpses of human warriors in powered armor fighting alongside their impossible ships. They moved like pack hunters, coordinating attacks across multiple dimensions, using tactics that seemed to border on precognition. But more than that, Chun continued, we learned to embrace paradox. Your science demands that the universe makes sense, that everything follow rules. Our science accepts that sometimes the universe is fundamentally insane, and we learn to be more insane than it is. Show them the Infinity Protocol, said another voice. A second human had appeared, or perhaps had always been there, wearing what looked like simple civilian clothing, but carrying herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Dr. Lisa Park, Chun introduced her, our chief theoretical physicist, and the woman who figured out how to make mathematics weep. Dr. Park nodded to the assembled counselors. The Shadow Fleet exists because reality has cancer. They're not invaders from another dimension. They're antibodies from a universe that's trying to cure itself of the infection called existence. Fighting them conventionally is like trying to cure cancer with positive thinking. She manipulated something in the air, and the chamber filled with equations that hurt to look at directly. Mathematical formulas that seemed to move and breathe, numbers that changed meaning while being observed. So we stopped fighting them conventionally, Park continued. We learned to fight them with aggressive impossibility. Our ships don't just break the laws of physics, they rewrite them locally. Our weapons don't destroy matter. They convince matter it never wanted to exist in the first place. And the cost? Asked Counselor Vex. The two humans exchanged glances, and, for just a moment, their facades of confidence cracked. Kethros saw exhaustion there, grief, and something that might have been madness. Everything, Chin said simply. Every time we use these technologies, we lose a little more of our sanity, our connection to normal reality. Every battle against the Shadow Fleet changes us into something less human and more other. Then why continue? Kethros found himself asking. Chin looked at him directly, and he saw something in her eyes that made him understand why her species had been able to fight cosmic horrors for millennia and still maintain hope. Because someone has to, she said. Because giving up means everything ends, and we're too stubborn to let that happen. Because somewhere in this galaxy there are species writing poetry, falling in love, discovering the joy of mathematics, and creating art that makes the universe a little less dark. The chamber was silent for a long moment. Finally, Counselor Prime Omega spoke. What exactly are you proposing? Partnership, Chin replied. We teach you what we can about fighting the Shadow Fleet. You provide us with resources, backup, and, most importantly, perspective. We've been fighting this war so long, we're starting to forget what we're fighting for. You can remind us why preservation of life and civilization matters. And if we refuse, Chin's expression became unreadable. Then we'll fight the Shadow Fleet when they come for you, same as we've done for every other species in this galaxy. We'll save as many of your people as we can, preserve what knowledge and culture we're able to, and add your story to the long list of civilizations that chose to face the darkness alone. She turned to leave, then paused. But understand this, we're offering you a chance to save yourselves. The next species the Shadow Fleet targets, after you won't get that opportunity. There won't be time to debate, to consider options, to make careful political calculations. There will only be 72 hours of screaming and then silence. As Captain Shin walked toward the chamber's exit, she seemed to fade slightly with each step, becoming translucent and, finally, disappearing entirely. Dr. Park followed, but just before she vanished, she spoke one final time. The vote needs to be unanimous. All 12 species, all agreeing to work together. The Shadow Fleet can sense division, uncertainty, fear. They use it against you. Unity is the only defense that actually works. And then the humans were gone, leaving the Galactic Council to debate the future of their civilization, while impossible warships waited in the void outside, crewed by a species that had learned to make reality itself cry uncle. The vote took 14 hours. 14 hours of heated debate, accusations, threats, and calculations that tried to determine if working with humans was more dangerous than facing the Shadow Fleet alone. In the end, it was unanimous, but only because the alternative was extinction. Now, 6 weeks later, Admiral Kethros stood aboard the human vessel Defiance, trying very hard not to lose his mind as he watched human crew members casually violate everything he thought he knew about reality. "Try not to think about it too much," advised Lieutenant Commander Jackson, the human officer assigned as his guide. "The ship's systems respond to observation. If you think too hard about how impossible something is, it might start working differently just to mess with you." Kethros watched a human engineer walk through a solid bulkhead, as if it weren't there, check something on the other side, and walk back through. The bulkhead remained solid the entire time. "How was that possible?" he asked, against his better judgment. "Phillips there has been working on Defiance for 8 years," Jackson explained casually. "The ship knows him. Trusts him. It lets him take certain liberties with physics, because he's never abused the privilege." They continued down a corridor that definitely hadn't existed when they entered it. Kethros had been mapping their route obsessively, and, according to his calculations, they were now walking through the space that should have been occupied by the ship's main reactor. When he pointed this out, Jackson just shrugged. "The ship's bigger on the inside than the outside. Had to be once we started installing reality distortion drives. Normal space couldn't contain all the equipment we needed, so we had to get creative with geometry. But that's impossible. Only if you assume space has to follow Euclidean geometry," Jackson replied. "Humans gave up that assumption about 200 years ago. Made space travel much easier once we stopped insisting that the universe had to make sense." They entered what Jackson called the Battle Analysis Center, though it looked more like a comfortable library with impossibly complex holographic displays floating between the bookshelves. Captain Sean was there, along with Dr. Park, and several other humans who seemed to exist in a constant state of barely contained chaos. "Admiral," Chun greeted him. "Perfect timing. We were just discussing your first lesson." "Lesson? How to see what's really there, Dar," Park said, gesturing to one of the displays. "Your species has excellent sensory equipment, but you've trained yourselves to ignore anything that doesn't fit your understanding of reality. That's going to get you killed when facing the Shadow Fleet." The display showed what appeared to be normal space, stars, planets, the usual cosmic debris. Then Park manipulated something, and the image changed. The space between stars wasn't empty. It was full of massive structures that hurt to look at directly, geometric forms that seemed to exist in too many dimensions simultaneously. "The Shadow Fleet doesn't hide," Park explained. "It exists in plain sight. But most species literally cannot see them until they choose to manifest fully into normal space. By then, it's far too late." "How do we learn to see them?" Kethros asked. "First, you have to accept that your understanding of reality is fundamentally flawed," Chin said bluntly. "Not incomplete, flawed. Wrong. Based on assumptions that make sense for creatures living on a single planet, but become dangerous when applied to cosmic-scale threats." Another human, introduced as Commander Sarah Okafor, stepped forward. "We're going to show you something that will either help you understand or drive you completely insane. Fair warning, it's driven several of our own people insane, and humans are much better at handling impossible things than most species." "What is it?" Kethros asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know. "We're going to show you how humans actually learned to fight the Shadow Fleet," Okafor said. "The real story, not the sanitized version we gave the Council." The displays around them shifted, and suddenly, Kethros was looking at what appeared to be a human colony world. Green continents, blue oceans, white clouds. It looked almost exactly like the paradise worlds described in ancient literature. "New Geneva," Chin said quietly. "Population 12 million. The first human world to encounter the Shadow Fleet." The image changed, showing the same planet, but wrong somehow. The colors were too vivid, the shadows fell in directions that made no geometric sense, and the clouds moved in patterns that suggested they were alive and afraid. "The Shadow Fleet doesn't just consume civilizations, Park explained. They consume the reality surrounding civilizations. Space-time itself begins to break down when they arrive. Kethros watched in growing horror as the planet began to change. Cities started folding in on themselves, not destroying, but becoming geometrically impossible. People in the streets moved in loops, living the same moments over and over as time itself became confused. We lost New Geneva, Chen said. Not just the people, the entire planet was consumed. But we had research teams there, scientists who had been experimenting with dimensional mechanics. As reality broke down around them, they made observations that should have been impossible. They learned that the Shadow Fleet isn't invincible. Okafor continued. They're parasites feeding on stable reality. But parasites can be poisoned if you're creative about it. The display shifted again, showing human scientists working frantically as reality dissolved around them. They were building something, devices that looked more like abstract art than functional equipment. Reality anchors, Park said. Machines that could maintain local stability even as the Shadow Fleet consumed everything around them. But the power requirements were enormous, and the psychological effects on the operators were severe. What kind of effects? The machines work by convincing local reality that it should behave according to human desires rather than universal laws, Chen explained. Operating them requires absolute confidence in your own perception of what should be possible. The stronger your will, the more reality bends. But human minds aren't designed to handle that kind of responsibility. Show him the first battle, Jackson said quietly. The display changed one final time, showing a scene that Kethros knew would haunt him for the rest of his life. Human ships, crude compared to the elegant vessels he'd seen recently, surrounded by Shadow Fleet entities. But the humans weren't just fighting with weapons. They were fighting with pure force of will, literally telling reality what it should be and somehow making it listen. The Battle of Dead Space, Chun said. 6 human vessels against a Shadow Fleet hunting pack. We shouldn't have stood a chance. But our crews had been trained on the reality anchors. They understood that physics was negotiable if you argued forcefully enough. In the display, Kethros watched human ships phase through enemy attacks, not because they had advanced shielding, but because their crews simply refused to believe the attacks should be able to harm them. Human weapons fired quantum uncertainty, creating explosions that existed in multiple probability states simultaneously. We won, Chen continued, but the cost was enormous. Half the crews suffered complete psychological breakdowns. The other half changed, became something between human and living equation. They could manipulate reality through will alone, but they gradually lost the ability to relate to anything real. The transcended, Park said softly. They're still out there, fighting the Shadow Fleet in dimensions we can't even perceive. They win battles by convincing the universe that victory is mathematically inevitable. Kethros felt sick. And this is what you want to teach us? No, Shin said firmly. This is what we learn not to teach anyone. The reality anchors were too dangerous, too destructive to the human psyche. We spent the next century developing safer methods, technologies that could bend reality without requiring the operator to abandon their sanity. That's what you saw in our current fleet, Okafor explained. Ships that use reality distortion engines, weapons that fire control paradoxes, shielding systems that convince attacks they should hit something else instead. All the power of the early reality anchors, but with safeguards to protect the crew's humanity. Mostly protect, Jackson corrected with a grin that was only slightly unhinged. The point, Chin said, shooting Jackson a warning look, is that fighting the Shadow Fleet requires accepting that reality is much more flexible than most species believe. Your people need to learn to see past the illusion of fixed physical laws without losing themselves in the process. How do we do that? Training, Park said. Mental exercises designed to expand your perception of what's possible without destroying your ability to function in normal reality. We'll teach your scientists to build modified reality anchors, less powerful than our originals, but much safer to operate. And your military forces, Chen added, will learn to fight alongside our ships, not as subordinates, but as partners. The Shadow Fleet has learned to counter many of our tactics over the centuries. Fresh perspectives, new approaches to impossible problems, that's what we need. Kethros looked around the room, at the humans who had casually described rewriting the laws of physics as if it were routine maintenance. They were offering to share technologies and knowledge that could elevate the Galactic Council to unimaginable heights of power. They were also offering to share the burden of an unending war against cosmic horrors that consumed reality itself. "When do we start?" he asked. Chun smiled, and for once it was actually reassuring rather than terrifying. "We already have. The moment you stepped aboard this ship, you began adapting to expanded reality. Your brain is learning to process impossible things without rejecting them outright. Give it a few more days, and you'll be able to see shadow, fleet entities with your naked eyes. Is that good or bad?" "Depends," Jackson said cheerfully. "Do you like sleeping at night? Because once you can see them, you realize they're everywhere. Hiding in the spaces between atoms, lurking in the quantum foam, watching and waiting for reality to weaken enough for them to break through." Dr. Park elbowed Jackson sharply. "What he means is awareness comes with responsibility. Once you can perceive the true threats facing this galaxy, ignorance is no longer an option." Admiral Kethros nodded slowly, feeling the weight of knowledge settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. Outside the ship's impossible windows, he could swear he was beginning to see shapes moving in the darkness between stars. Vast, hungry things that had been there all along, just waiting for someone to finally notice them. The war, he realized, had already begun. The question now was whether the combined forces of humans and the Galactic Council would be enough to hold back the tide of living darkness that wanted to devour everything they had built. Looking at the humans around him, beings who had spent centuries learning to make impossibility into a weapon, he began to think they might actually have a chance. The first joint training exercise was supposed to be a simple simulation. 3 Galactic Council ships working alongside 2 human vessels to defend a mock civilian convoy from simulated Shadow Fleet entities. It was meant to be educational, controlled, safe. It became a nightmare within the first 10 minutes. Admiral Kethros stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Resolute Dawn, watching his tactical displays struggle to make sense of what they were showing him. The simulation had begun normally, Council ships in standard defensive formation, the convoy moving at a steady pace through hyperspace, sensors sweeping for threats according to established protocols. Then, the human ships had simply vanished. "Where are they?" demanded Commander Voss, his tactical officer. "They were right there, maintaining formation, and then they're still there," interrupted Dr. Sheila Martinez, the human liaison assigned to his ship. "You just can't see them anymore because they've shifted into combat mode." "That's impossible. Our sensors can detect anything in normal space." Dr. Martinez smiled with the same patient expression humans used when explaining basic concepts to children. "Your sensors detect things that exist in normal space. Combat mode, human vessels exist in the spaces between normal space." "Show me," Kethros ordered. Martinez manipulated a device that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and mathematical theories. The tactical display shifted, revealing new dimensions of information that made Kethros's head hurt. The human ships weren't gone. They were existing in several different probability states simultaneously, overlapping normal space without quite touching it. "This is how we approach Shadow Fleet entities," Martinez explained. "If you exist fully in normal space, they can consume you. If you exist fully outside normal space, you can't affect them. The trick is to exist in both states at once while convincing reality that this makes perfect sense." The simulation continued, with the convoy moving deeper into the test area. According to the parameters, this was where the first Shadow Fleet scouts would appear. But the sensors showed nothing except empty space. "Contact," announced sensor operator Quirrell suddenly. Multiple unknown entities bearing all of them, bearing everywhere. Kethros looked at the display and felt his sanity slip slightly. The space around the convoy was suddenly full of things that shouldn't exist. Massive, writhing forms that seemed to be made of living darkness and malevolent geometry. They appeared to exist in the gaps between moments, visible only when you weren't looking directly at them. "How many?" he asked. "I can't count them," Quirrell replied, his voice shaking. They don't follow number rules. There are 3 of them, but also 17, but also one that contains all the others." "Welcome to fighting the Shadow Fleet," Martinez said calmly. "Logic is the first casualty in every engagement." The Shadow Fleet entities, simulated ones, Kethros reminded himself desperately, began moving toward the convoy. They didn't accelerate or change course in any recognizable way. They simply became closer, as if distance itself was losing meaning in their presence. "All ships, engage defensive pattern Alpha," Kethros ordered. His vessels moved into formation, weapons charging, shields raised to maximum power. It was a textbook defensive maneuver, one they'd practiced thousands of times against every known threat in the galaxy. The Shadow Fleet entities ignored their weapons completely. Energy beams passed through the creatures without effect. Missiles simply ceased to exist when they got too close. Kinetic projectiles hit their targets, but caused no damage because the entities refused to acknowledge that physical force was relevant to them. "How do we fight something that doesn't follow the rules?" Boss asked desperately. "You don't fight them," Martinez replied. "You convince them to fight themselves." She activated another device, and the human ships suddenly became visible again, but wrong somehow. They appeared to exist in several locations at once, their weapons firing impossibly complex patterns that seemed designed more for artistic expression than tactical effectiveness. But the weapons were working. Where human fire struck Shadow Fleet entities, the creatures began to unravel wasn't the right word. They began to doubt their own existence, their forms becoming less certain, their movements more confused. "What are they firing?" Kethros asked. "Weaponized paradox," Martinez explained as if this was perfectly normal. "The ammunition doesn't explode on impact. It convinces the target that it should have exploded before it was fired. The target gets confused trying to figure out the temporal logistics and becomes vulnerable to conventional attack." "That's insane." "Yes," Martinez agreed cheerfully. "Sanity is a luxury we gave up around the time we realized the universe was actively trying to kill us." The battle continued, but it wasn't following any tactical doctrine Kethros had ever studied. The human ships moved like they were dancing rather than fighting, their positions seemingly random, but somehow perfectly coordinated. They fired weapons that shouldn't exist at targets that ignored conventional physics, and, through some miracle of applied insanity, it was actually working. "Your turn," Martinez announced suddenly. "What?" "Your ships need to engage. The simulation requires all participants to demonstrate combat effectiveness against Shadow Fleet entities." Kethros stared at the tactical display, watching his weapons fail repeatedly against creatures that existed primarily as concepts rather than physical objects. "Ow! Nothing we have can hurt them." "Your weapons are fine," Martinez said. "You just need to stop thinking of them as weapons and start thinking of them as suggestions." "Suggestions?" "Tell the universe what you think should happen. Don't fire weapons at the Shadow Fleet entities. Fire the idea of weapons at the idea of targets. Make reality understand that your attack should work, because you believe they should work." It was the most ridiculous thing Kethros had ever heard. It was also, according to 3 weeks of human instruction, the fundamental principle of fighting cosmic horrors that existed outside normal physical law. "All ships," he announced, his voice steady despite his certainty that he was about to destroy his career and possibly his sanity, "weapons free. Target the Shadow Fleet entities with full confidence that our attacks will be effective. Believe in your weapons, trust in your training, and remember that reality is much more negotiable than we were taught." His crew stared at him. Commander Voss opened his mouth to object, then closed it again. Quirrell looked confused, but began targeting solutions anyway. The weapons officer, a stoic hegemony veteran named Thorak, simply nodded and powered up the main batteries. "Firing," Thorak announced. The Resolute Dawn's energy cannons fired, and for a moment nothing seemed different. The beams struck the Shadow Fleet entities exactly as they had before, passing through without effect. Then Kethros did something that went against every instinct of his military training. He stopped caring about what should happen and started believing in what he wanted to happen. The energy beams suddenly became solid, striking the Shadow Fleet entities with visible force. The creatures recoiled, their forms becoming less certain, more vulnerable. Other Council ships, seeing the example, began to achieve similar results as their crews abandoned conventional thinking and embraced the fundamentally irrational nature of their situation. Excellent, Martinez said, checking readings that included equations with imaginary numbers and measurements expressed in units of pure stubbornness. Your crews are adapting faster than most species. The hegemony's synthetic beings are particularly good at this. They're already programmed to accept contradictory information without experiencing psychological breakdown. The simulation ended with the convoy successfully defended and all Shadow Fleet entities either destroyed or convinced to exist somewhere else. As the tactical displays returned to normal space physics, Kethros felt a strange sense of loss, as if someone had turned off music he hadn't realized he was hearing. "How do you stand it?" he asked Martinez. "Living with the knowledge that reality is so unstable, so dependent on collective belief rather than physical law." Martinez was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the stars through the bridge's main window. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of centuries of human experience with impossible warfare. "It's terrifying," she admitted, "knowing that the universe is held together by nothing more than a general consensus that it should continue existing. Knowing that there are entities out there that could unravel everything just by disagreeing strongly enough with the concept of matter." She turned to face him, and Kethros saw something in her eyes that he was beginning to recognize in all humans. A combination of fear, determination, and stubborn refusal to surrender even when facing impossible odds. "But it's also liberating," she continued. "Once you accept that reality is negotiable, you realize that so are all the limitations you thought were absolute. Death becomes temporary if you argue persuasively enough. Distance becomes irrelevant if you refuse to acknowledge it. Impossibility becomes just another obstacle to overcome through creative application of selective ignorance. And the madness?" Martinez laughed, and the sound was only slightly unhinged. "The madness is the price of admission to the real universe, the one that exists beyond the simple, safe physics they teach children, the one where consciousness shapes matter instead of the other way around." She gestured toward the displays, still showing traces of the simulation. "Your people did well today. In a few more exercises like this, they'll be ready for real combat against Shadow Fleet entities. Not ready to win easily, but ready to survive long enough to learn. And after that, we start teaching you the really dangerous techniques. The ones that require you to forget everything you think you know about being alive in a predictable universe." Admiral Kethros nodded slowly, watching his crew review the simulation data with expressions of confusion, excitement, and barely controlled terror. They were adapting to the human way of thinking, learning to treat physics as suggestions rather than laws. It was the most dangerous knowledge he had ever encountered. It was also, he was beginning to understand, the only knowledge that could save them from the darkness between stars that hungered for the concept of existence itself. Outside the ship's windows, space looked the same as it always had, empty, peaceful, governed by eternal laws that could be calculated and predicted. But Kethros knew better now. He could sense the vast, patient entities moving in the spaces between atoms, waiting for reality to weaken enough for them to break through. The real war was about to begin. The real Shadow Fleet arrived 17 days earlier than predicted. Admiral Kethros was reviewing training reports when every alarm on the Joint Human Council Command Station began screaming simultaneously. Not the measured, organized alerts of a standard emergency, but the chaos of warning systems that couldn't agree on what they were detecting. "Contact report," he shouted over the noise. "Unknown entities emerging from hyperspace," reported Commander Voss, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Multiple contacts bearing. I can't get consistent readings. The sensors keep contradicting themselves." Captain Sean materialized on the command deck without using any of the ship's transporters or even walking through a door. She simply became present, as if reality had suddenly remembered she was supposed to be there. "They're early," she announced grimly. "The Shadow Fleet has learned to mask their approach by eating the space-time around their target before manifesting. We didn't detect them because the region they were traveling through stopped existing 3 days ago." Kethros felt cold certainty settle in his stomach. "How many?" 17 confirmed hunting entities, plus what appears to be a Devourer-class reality sink, Chun replied, checking readings on a device that seemed to exist partially in her hand and partially in dimensions he couldn't perceive. This isn't a scouting force. This is a harvest fleet. The main display activated, showing local space with the enhanced perception filters the humans had installed. What Kethro saw nearly made him lose consciousness. The Shadow Fleet entities were massive beyond comprehension, each one the size of small moon, but wrong in ways that made his mind hurt. They moved through space like living black holes, but instead of bending light, they bent the concept of existence itself. Defense Plan Omega, he ordered, surprised at how steady his voice sounded. All Council vessels to defensive positions. Civilian evacuation protocols are now in effect. Sir, interrupted Dr. Martinez, who had somehow appeared next to Captain Chin despite being on a completely different ship moments before, civilian evacuation won't work. The Shadow Fleet doesn't just consume people. They consume the idea that those people ever existed. Standard evacuation procedures assume the evacuees have somewhere to exist after they escape. Then, what do you recommend? Chun and Martinez exchanged glances, and Kethro saw something pass between them that looked like a decision being made without words. We're going to try something we've never attempted before, Chin said. We're going to teach an entire civilization to exist incorrectly. What does that mean? It means, Martinez explained, pulling out equipment that looked like it had been built by someone who had only heard mathematics described secondhand. We're going to convince reality that the Galactic Council species exist in a parallel dimension that the Shadow Fleet can't access. Not actually moving you there, just convincing the universe that you're already there. That's impossible. Yes, Chin agreed. Completely impossible, which is why it might work. The Shadow Fleet has spent eons learning to counter every possible defense. They've never encountered an impossible defense because most species won't attempt something that can't work. The first Shadow Fleet entity reached the outer sensor perimeter, and immediately the universe began to behave strangely. Stars in the distance flickered as if someone was rapidly turning them on and off. Space itself took on a grainy quality, like a bad holographic recording. Reality degradation beginning, reported sensor operator Quirrell, his voice disturbingly calm. Local space-time coherence dropping rapidly. At current rates, we have approximately 6 hours before matter in this region becomes too unstable to support organized existence. 6 hours to save a civilization, Chin muttered. New personal record for impossible deadlines. The human fleet moved into formation around the Council vessels, their ships phase-shifting between multiple states of existence, so rapidly it was painful to watch. They weren't just preparing for battle. They were preparing to convince the universe that the battle was taking place somewhere else entirely. All Council vessels, Kethro's broadcast on all frequencies, prepare for emergency reality displacement. This is not a drill, and it is not scientifically possible. We're going to attempt to relocate our entire civilization to a dimension that doesn't exist using technology that can't work. Trust your human advisors, and try not to think too hard about the contradictions. The response from the Council fleet was immediate. Dozens of ships reporting various states of readiness, confusion, and barely controlled terror. But they were responding, which was more than most species managed when facing their first Shadow Fleet incursion. Beginning Phase 1, Martinez announced, activating equipment that caused the air around her to develop mathematical properties. Convincing local reality that Galactic Council species are native to Parallel Dimension 7 Alpha impossible. The effect was immediate and nauseating. Kethros felt himself becoming less solid, as if he was transforming into a probability cloud that happened to be shaped like a military officer. Around him, his crew flickered between states of existence, sometimes fully present, sometimes translucent, occasionally existing as pure information rather than matter. Phase 2, Chin called out, her voice coming from several directions at once. Establishing quantum uncertainty buffer around all Council vessels. Remember, if the Shadow Fleet can't be certain you exist, they can't consume you. The tactical display now showed something that defied every principle of visual representation. The Council fleet appeared to exist in multiple locations simultaneously while also not existing at all. The Shadow Fleet entities approached these uncertain positions with obvious confusion, their forms becoming less definite as they try to target things that might not be real. It's working, Voss reported with amazement. The Shadow Fleet entities are having difficulty maintaining coherence. They keep trying to consume us, but they can't figure out what us refers to. Don't celebrate yet, Martinez warned. This is the easy part. Now we have to maintain this state while fighting back. Chun, are you ready for the Paradox Offensive? Ready as anyone can be for something that will probably drive us all completely insane, Chun replied. All human vessels, initiate Schrödinger Protocol. We're going to attack the Shadow Fleet with weapons that exist only when they're not being used. What followed was the strangest battle in the history of galactic warfare. Human ships fired weapons that existed in quantum superposition, simultaneously hitting and missing their targets until the moment of impact collapsed the probability wave. Shadow Fleet entities tried to consume vessels that flickered between existing and not existing so rapidly that reality itself couldn't keep track. Council vessels, you need to engage now, Chen commanded. Fire everything you have while believing with absolute certainty that you're somewhere else entirely. Kethros gave the order, and the Council fleet opened fire with weapons that shouldn't have been able to affect entities existing outside normal space-time. But because they were firing while existing in a state of dimensional uncertainty, their weapons became uncertain as well, existing in whatever state was necessary to damage their targets. The battle raged for 3 hours that felt like several years. Reality shifted constantly around them. Sometimes they were fighting in normal space, sometimes in the quantum foam between atomic particles, sometimes in dimensions that existed only in the imagination of particularly creative mathematicians. We're actually winning, Voss reported with disbelief. The Shadow Fleet entities are withdrawing. They can't maintain coherence in a reality that refuses to behave consistently. But their victory came with a price. As the last Shadow Fleet entity retreated into whatever dark dimension spawned them, the makeshift reality displacement field began to collapse. The Council fleet materialized back in a normal space, their crews intact, but fundamentally changed. Medical teams to all stations, Kethros ordered. I want full psychological evaluations for every crew member who participated in the dimensional displacement. Sir, Quirrell reported, I'm not sure that's necessary. Look at the crew efficiency ratings. Kethros checked the data and found something remarkable. Instead of the psychological damage they'd expected from existing in multiple states simultaneously, his crews were showing enhanced problem-solving abilities, improved creativity, and a disturbing tendency to find conventional physics boring. What happened to them? He asked Martinez. They learned to think outside the universe, she replied with a grin that was only moderately insane. Once you've existed as a probability cloud while firing weapons made of crystallized impossibility at entities that eat reality for breakfast, normal problems seem pretty manageable. Captain Chin approached, looking tired but satisfied. The Shadow Fleet will be back eventually. They always come back, but they'll be much more cautious now. They've never encountered a civilization that could defend itself by collectively agreeing to exist somewhere else. What happens now? Now we teach this technique to other species. Build a network of civilizations that exist in a state of strategic uncertainty. The Shadow Fleet thrives on consuming ordered, predictable reality. If we can make enough of the galaxy unpredictable enough, we might actually be able to push them back permanently. Kethros looked around his command deck, watching his crew perform their duties with casual competence, while occasionally phasing through solid objects when they weren't paying attention. They had survived their first encounter with cosmic horror by learning to exist incorrectly, and somehow this felt like the beginning of something larger. Admiral, Chin continued, I have a proposition for you. The humans have been fighting this war alone for centuries. We've gotten good at it, but we've also gotten strange. We need partners who can help us remember what normal existence feels like. And in return, we teach you everything we know about fighting the impossible. How to build ships that exist in multiple dimensions. How to fire weapons made of pure stubbornness. How to convince the universe that your enemies should really consider existing somewhere else for their own good. Kethros nodded slowly, watching the human vessels prepare to depart for whatever impossible mission awaited them next. The Galactic Council had entered this alliance hoping to learn advanced technology and gain powerful military allies. Instead, They had learned that reality was far stranger and more dangerous than they had ever imagined. They had also learned that with enough creativity, stubbornness, and willingness to embrace calculated insanity, even cosmic horrors could be defeated. "When do we start advanced training?" he asked. Chen's smile was genuinely warm for the first time since they'd met. "We already have, Admiral." The moment you stopped thinking of the impossible as a limitation and started thinking of it as a starting point, your species took the first step toward mastering the real universe. Outside the command station's windows, space looked peaceful and empty again. But Kethros knew better now. He could sense the vast machinery of existence working behind the visible stars, the delicate balance between order and chaos that kept reality stable. And somewhere in the darkness between galaxies, ancient things waited patiently for that balance to tip in their favor. The war against cosmic horror would continue. But for the first time in human history, they wouldn't be fighting alone. The Galactic Council had joined them in the space between possible and impossible, where the real battles for existence were fought. And together, they were learning to win.